tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So usually on these occasions, these festival days, instead of giving a regular Dhamma talk, I tell some stories from the Buddhist sources. And I've been doing this project with Dantaka on Buddhist history. And one of the recent ones was King Asoka, and I read up everything I could find on King Asoka. And there are a lot of really fantastic legendary stuff. Didn't get into the more sober history video. So I'm going to tell some of the stories about King Asoka. First of all, by way of preface, the historical facts about King Asoka that we know of. He was the third king of the Mauryan dynasty, grandson of the great Chandragupta, who fought Alexander the Great. And between his father and his grandfather and him, they conquered the whole of the subcontinent. He had this huge empire, and he was the first Buddhist king of the whole of India. There were Buddhist kings before in smaller kingdoms, but he was the great Buddhist emperor and spread Buddhism outside of India in a big way for the first time by sending missionaries in all directions, including, very importantly, Sri Lanka. And he became very much a figure of legend. Many fantastic tales are told of King Asoka, beginning with how he became King Asoka, why he took that birth. At the time of the Buddha was walking on alms round with Ananda in a town, and there was a raggedy street kid playing in the dirt and making mud castles in the dirt. And when he saw the Buddha, he became overwhelmed by faith, and he wanted to make an offering, but he had nothing to give. So he made a mud pie and put it in the Buddha's bowl. And Ananda got upset, how could this wretched little kid be putting mud in the Buddha's bowl? And the Buddha said, "Say not so, Ananda, say not so. That handful of dirt shall become the whole of Jambudvipa, the Indian subcontinent." And he gave the mud pie to Ananda, and he said, "Take this back to the hermitage, mix it with cow dung and fragrant herbs, and spread it on my walking path." And that little kid was reborn 200 years later as Asoka. And indeed, that handful of dirt became the whole of Jambudvipa. But also, it was an act of mixed karma, because for his pious offering to the Buddha, he became the emperor of India. But for putting something unclean in the Buddha's bowl, he was born with unpleasant, rough skin. And this detail comes up at the early part of Asoka's reign. Before he became a Buddhist, he was given the name of Chandasoka, which means Asoka the Fierce. And he was said to be very bloody-handed, killing people for the slightest offense. And one time he was in the pleasure garden with 100 of his wives, and they were under an Asoka tree, the same name as him. It's a beautiful Indian tree, the Asoka tree. And he fell asleep under the tree, and his concubines were not pleased with him because of his rough skin. They didn't really enjoy being intimate with him. So out of spitefulness, they cut all of the flowers off the Asoka tree and threw them away. So when he woke up, the Asoka tree was bare, and he flew into a rage, and he had all those 100 concubines wrapped in oilcloth and burned alive. one of his ministers advised him, "Sir, your Majesty, you're killing all these people with your own hand, running them through with a sword, and it's sort of not a good look. What you ought to do is find an executioner." So he said, "That sounds like a good idea. I'll delegate that work. I'll give you the job to go and find somebody suitable." So this minister went on a bit of a tour looking for somebody suitable, and in a village he found that there was this one young man who all the other villagers were terrified of. He was what we would call in modern times, we would call him a psychopath or a sociopath. When he was a little kid, his favorite amusement was catching small animals and torturing them to death. And all the other villagers stayed clear of him. And his name was Chandigirika. And this minister thought he'd be the very suitable person for this bloody-handed job. So he asked Chandigirika if he wanted the job as the king's executioner. And he said, "Yeah, but I have to ask my parents first." So he goes home and he asks his parents, and they say no, so he kills them both. And then on their way back to the palace, they stop for their rest at a monastery. And the monk at the monastery happens to be giving a Dhamma talk on the Balapandita Sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya, which is the sutta which describes all the torments in hell, where people are burned and impaled on stakes and thrown in pots of boiling oil and raked over with razors, on and on and on. And Chandigirika thought this was just great. He's making notes. When he got to King Asoka, the king hired him for the job, and Chandigirika says, "I have a request, Your Majesty. I'd like to build a prison where I can torture the wrongdoers, and I'd like the rule to be that no one can enter the prison and leave it alive." And the king agreed to that. So he had this prison built that they called the Beautiful Jail, because on the outside it looked like a lovely place with nice paint and carvings and flower gardens. But inside it was as close as he could make it to Naraya hell. And anyone who went in there, he tortured them in various ways until they were dead. And this became obviously a place of terror in the kingdom. And there was a novice monk named Samudra who was very spiritually advanced. He was one of those cases where he attained to arahantship while getting his head shaved before his ordination. So he was already an arahant, and he was wandering the country, and he didn't know about this jail. He thought it was just like a regular house, and he went there to beg for alms and made the mistake of going inside, and so now he's a prisoner of Chandigirika. And Chandigirika put him in the pot of boiling oil, but then it was just like a nice warm bath for him. He had, his supernormal powers. It didn't harm him. So Chandigirika sent word to the king, there's something untoward happening in my prison. And the king came to see what was going on, King Asoka. And this novice floated up in the air, levitated above the copper pot, and gave a Dhamma talk on compassion, which stirred Asoka's heart and converted him. And he decided that he'd been doing wrong, and now he saw a better way. And the novice flew out the door. He just left. No one could stop him. And then Chandigirika says to the king, "Your Majesty, do you remember the promise you made when I built this place? That no one could enter and leave alive?" And the king said, "Yes." He says, "Well, sir, you entered." And then King Asoka says, "Well, let's think about this. Who was here first, you or me?" "Well, I was." Well, very much so. And he killed Chandagirika, the last person he killed with his own hand, and had the prison torn down, and that was the end of that. And then he started studying Buddhism and became a devout Buddhist. His fame and his majesty extended beyond the human realm. It said that his power extended 1 yojana below the earth and 1 yojana above, as well as covering the whole of Jambudvipa. And he was sometimes given the title of a Dipa Chakrawatu, a wheel-turning monarch of one island. And various other non-human beings served him as well. King Wesawana, the king of the north, one of the Dewas of the Chaturmarajaka level, who was the lord of yakas, he assigned yakas to fetch water from Lake Anotata every day to provide the needs of the king in the palace. Lake Anotata is up in the Himavant, the magical land to the far north beyond the mountains. And at the very center of the Himavant is Lake Anotata, the hidden lake. It's hidden because it's surrounded by mountains that curve inwards, so it can't be seen from any direction or from the air. And the water of Lake Anotata is said to be very pure and magical and has great healing powers. It's also the source of all the great rivers of Jambudvipa. 4 rivers come out, one in each direction, and they circle 3 times around the lake. They don't cross each other. They either plunge under the ground or they fly up in the air when they would cross. And when you look at the night sky, you see what we call the Milky Way. The Indians call that Akasaganga, the Sky Ganga. That's the river Ganges in the section that flies through the air. And these yakas would serve King Wesawana, and he would work them very hard. Sometimes they would die of exhaustion in his service. But his rule was if they served him faithfully for 7 years, then he would grant them a territory where they could eat people. So he always had many yakas in his beck and call, and fetching water from Lake Anotata was one of his regular chores. King Asoka also had parrots that would fly up into the Himavant and gather rare fruits and bring them back. And Dewas would bring him rice from Lake Chandata, which is another lake in the Himavant. And this very fine rice. Armies of mice would husk the rice every day, so they would have rice for the palace. And his forges and armories, it said that bears swung the hammers in the forge. So he had all these non-human beings, dewas and yakas and animals and birds serving him, as well as humans. There was one other incident later in which he reverted somewhat to his old ways by making an act of misguided piety, you could say. There was some Ajivaka made a painting and put it on public display of the Buddha bowing down to the Ajivaka leader, Makali Gosala. And this enraged Asoka, and he put a reward on the head of a Jivaka ascetics. Anybody cuts the head off an Jivaka ascetic, they'll get a piece of gold. So for a while there was a great slaughter of Ajivakas. Now one of the king's brothers had taken ordination as a Buddhist monk, and he got ill, and he was by himself in a little kuti. He was very sick for a long time, and he wasn't able to take care of himself properly, and his hair and beard grew out, and his robes got very soiled and ragged. And when he started to recover, he went outside of his kuti naked with long hair, and his robe was not fit to wear, and somebody mistook him for an Ajivaka and cut his head off. The Ajivakas are these long-haired, shaggy ascetics. And they sent the head to the king to get his gold coin, and then he saw his brother's head. He fell down in a swoon of despair. And then one of the Buddhist monks, Upagupta, took advantage of the king's state of mind to try and talk some sense into him. And he told him, this is not the way of the Buddha to be killing people like that. You're violating the precepts, and you're not acting according to Dhamma. This has to stop. So he ordered a stop to that. This was in part motivation for the kings. Then became very devoted to making merit. He wanted to make merit and overcome all this bad karma. And one of the ways he did this was by building stupas. At the time of the Buddha's parinibbana, after his cremation, there was almost a war as various kings and powers from the republics, they were demanding the relics. And they all wanted the relics to go to their country. And the crisis was averted when a Brahmin named Drona got them to agree on an equitable division of the relics into 8 claimants. And each one built a stupa and put the relics in the stupa. And these were called the Drona stupas. And Ajatasattu thought that, of course, they were all not too far from each other geographically because the Buddhism hadn't spread very far. They were all in the Ganges Valley. And King Asoka wanted all his subjects to have the opportunity of making merit. It was considered a very high religious practice to circumambulate a stupa that contained relics. So he made the decision to break up the Drona stupas and gather the relics and divide them into 84,000 sections and build a stupa for each section, each fragment of the relics. So when he was going around to these old stupas, when he came to the one built by Ajatasattu, it was defended by a mechanical sword wheel that whenever he approached, it started whirling. He couldn't get past it. And Vesakama, the Deva from Tawatingsa, who's the architect of the gods, the craftsman of the gods, he appeared and shot an arrow into the center of the sword wheel and immobilized it. And King Asoka entered the stupa to get the relics, and a voice cried out, "Enter here, wretched king." And that upset the Ajatasattu. Why are they calling me wretched? And there was an oil lamp inside the stupa that as soon as Asoka got the relics and was leaving, the lamp went out. And he asked Upagupta, his monk advisor, how did Ajatasattu know exactly how much oil to have that lamp that it would last just this long? And Upagupta said, they had very good calculators at the time of the Buddha. One of the individuals that Ajatasattu encountered was the monk Pindola Bharadvaja. When Asoka threw a big meal offering for the bhikkhus, and they were all seated in their places. Asoka knew all these, all the senior monks. The senior monk left a space open at the head of the line, and Asoka said, "Surely, sir, are you not the senior most monk in Jambudvipa?" And he said, "No, Lord, I'm not. There's one senior to me." And Pindola Bharavaja entered, very striking looking figure, upright and hale and hearty, but quite grey. And he sat in the head seat. And his story is that he was the monk at the time of the Buddha that appears in a sutta in the Digha Nikaya, where the village people, having a county fair, they put on this kind of a contest where they raise up a pole and it's greased. And it's like high up in the air, and there's a golden bowl on the top of the pole. Whoever can climb up gets it. So it's a lot of laughs for everybody as they watch people trying to climb the pole and falling down. And then Pindola comes along, and he hears what's going on, so he uses his psychic powers to levitate up and take the bowl. And when this gets back to the Buddha becomes cross with Pindola, and he says, "You shouldn't be displaying your psychic powers in public like that. That's not allowed. Don't do it anymore." But then sometime later, the Buddha and some of his senior disciples were flying through the air to go up to a visit to Tawatingsa heaven. And Pindola saw them flying overhead, and he flew up to join them. And the Buddha said, "Pindola, I told you not to use your psychic powers anymore. Your punishment is you are not allowed to enter parinirvana till the end of the age." So he had to wander around the earth. And some say he's still here, and he lives in Thailand, and he's an advisor to the royal family. And there's rumors that a similar thing happens. They'll have a big offering to the monks, and there's senior monks that are like 90 years old and ordained when they were novices of 12, at the front. They leave one space open, and this young-looking monk looks like he's about 30. He comes striding in and sits down at the front of the line.
What is the end of the age?
End of the world. End of the world system. So Asoka gets into conversation with Pindola, and he offers him with his own hands. He offers him the rice, and he wants to give him a cup of buttermilk, knowing he's so old. He's like 250 years old. He says, "Sir, this is buttermilk. It's quite strong. Maybe it's too strong for you." And Pindola says, No problem. In the Buddha's time, even water was stronger than this buttermilk. How is that so? And with his psychic power, Pindola reaches down under the earth to the depth of half a yojana, and he pulls up a handful of clay, like loamy soil that has a very perfumey, rich smell. And he says, "Men of these days have such little merit that all the goodness is sinking deep into the earth." Now this monk Upagupta, he's kind of an interesting story about him too. He became the chief Buddhist advisor to Asoka. And before he met Asoka, he had an encounter with Mara. He was giving a public Dhamma talk, and Mara wanted to disrupt his talk, so he showered the crowd with gold coins. So of course the crowd broke up. They weren't paying attention to the Dhamma talk anymore. And Upagupta thought, it must be Mara. And then the second time it happened, he showered the crowd with jewels. And then the third time he did it, he brought acharas, the celestial dancing girls, the nymphs of heaven, to dance in the sky. And of course, totally disrupt the Dhamma talk. And then Mara felt cocky enough to confront Upagupta. And Upagupta says to him, well, sir, you've disrupted my talk 3 times. I suppose I have to give you this, give you the honors. And he put a wreath of flowers around Mara's neck. And Mara was at first really happy. He thought he'd beaten this monk. But as soon as the wreath of flowers went around his neck, it turned into a rotting corpse of a dog, a pig, and a man. And Mara couldn't get these rotten corpses off his neck. So he ran away and he went to various deities. He went to Saka and to Varuna and to Yama, Sunimata, asking them, can you get this off my neck? And they all said, no, we can't. It's beyond our power. And he went to Brahma. And Brahma said, the only one who can take this off your neck is Upagupta. So he went back to earth and he apologized to Upagupta. And Upagupta said, I'll take this foul thing off your neck if you do 2 things. Oh, anything. First, you must promise never to harass the bhikkhus ever again. And secondly, I didn't have enough merit myself to be reborn in the time of the Buddha. And although I know the Buddha's teachings, I haven't seen the Buddha's form. And I would like you to manifest illusion of the Buddha's form so I could see what he looked like. So Mara agreed to these requests, and Upagupta took the corpses off and they changed back into a wreath of flowers. And then Mara changed into the form of the Buddha, and Upagupta was overjoyed and overcome by the sight. And Mara, thereafter, this Mara was no longer the Mara. He was now converted and tamed. And he rang a bell in the village or the town square, proclaiming that everyone should listen to Upagupta. He's the wise monk who knows all the teachings. But I suspect there must be another Mara, because there does seem to be still some degree of delusion and desire and ignorance left in the world. Mm-hmm. Another great being that King Asoka encountered was the Naga Mahakala. He's one of the great Nagas that lives for an entire world age. Said to be 5 of them. And the Mahakala is the one who was dwelling in the river beside where the Buddha took his last meal before his enlightenment. And at that time, the Buddha, after eating the rice dish that the shepherd girl gave him, he put the bowl in the water and made the statement, if I am destined to attain enlightenment this night, may this bowl float upstream. And it did. It floated some distance upstream and then sank. And it fell to the bottom of the river and hit a pile of 3 other bowls from the 3 previous Buddhas, and made a clinking sound that woke Mahakala in his sleep. And he saw the bowl and he said, oh, another Buddha has arisen in the world so soon. And Asoka had Mahakala brought before him and sat him on the throne and asked him to tell him about the Buddha. Towards the end of Asoka's life, which was a long one, he had a prolonged illness and he was laid up in bed. And he was still desperate to make merit before he died and ensure his future rebirth. And he kept giving more and more to the Sangha. At one point, he donated the whole of Jambudipa to the Sangha, and then redeemed it with 100,000 pieces of gold. And his son, who was going to inherit the kingdom, began to become concerned that his father was wasting the resources of the kingdom. He was being too generous, and he was going to ruin the economy of the country with his lavish gifts to the Sangha. So he took measures to bring the treasury under his own control and cut King Asoka off from the ability to give away all the kingdom's riches. And Asoka was reduced to giving away his own personal possessions until he was completely without anything left to give. And at the very last few days of his life, after a meal, he had only left 1/2 of a mirobellum. This is a small bitter fruit, like a medicinal fruit. And he said, at one time I had the whole of Jambudipa in my hand. Now my wealth is reduced to 1/2 a mirobellum. And he gave it to a servant and said, take this to the monastery and donate it to the Sangha. And he took it to the monastery, and the head monk said, this is a very significant gift. And he had it chopped up into the finest pieces they could and mixed in with the monks' rice, so all the monks got some taste of it. Oh, there's one, this is getting a bit out of order. I don't want to leave this out. There's one legendary story about King Asoka, that at one time a Brahmin, because they were always kind of rivals of the Buddhists, he wanted to make a mockery of the king and his Buddhist followers. He had psychic powers, and he assumed the form of the god Shiva. And he brought 200 Brahmins with him to the palace, flying through the air, and demanded they be fed. So the king had a luxurious feast laid out on the tables, and the Brahmins didn't touch it. And this head Brahmin said, we don't eat such food. Well, what do you eat? We only eat Buddhist monks. So the king didn't know what to do. He thought this was Shiva. And then this novice, Samudra, who we met before, he shows up, and he said, I'll take care of this. And he went into the hall and he said, I volunteer to let you eat me, but first you have to feed me. And he ate all the food of the 200 Brahmins and said he was still hungry. So they brought more and more food until they emptied the kitchens and the storehouses. And he said he's still hungry. So he ate the 200 Brahmins and Shiva. And then the king was upset. Like, what now? You're going to eat you're going to eat me and the rest of the court? He said, don't worry, your majesty. Come with me. And he led him back to the monastery, and there were the 200 Brahmins seated quietly in rows, now in Buddhist robes with shaved heads. They were all ordained Buddhist monks now. So that's a few of the colorful stories that are told about King Asoka.
Ajahn, can I just ask, this brother Tissa,
Yeah.
who lost his head because he was mistakenly taken to be Jiva something, is it the same brother who offered his head when that minister was killing people?
They give him a different name, but I think there's a lot of these stories you can see there's a parallel.
Huh.
That version I told just now is from the Asoka Wadana. The other version, which is a bit milder, is from the Dipa Wangsa.
But you think it's the same story?
Yeah, I think it's a different elaboration of the same story. There was there probably was, I would guess, this is my speculation, that there was some incident early in Asoka's reign when there was some killing of religious people, whether in the other story it was Buddhist monks being killed.
Yeah.
The other version of the story is that because of Asoka's generosity to the Sangha, there was a lot of rascals and scoundrels pretending to be monks just to get food and lodging. And so the good monks were uncertain who is who, and they weren't able to perform Sangakamas like Patimokkha for 7 years, because it's a serious Vinaya offense to hold Patimokkha with someone who's outside of that ordained group, the Samwasa. So and so they couldn't do ordinations either. They couldn't do any Sangakamas. So it was a very dangerous thing for the Sangha in the long run. So in the Dipawangsa version, Asoka's not guilty directly of any killing. He sent one of his ministers to order those monks to perform Sangakama. And he went to the monastery, but they wouldn't obey him. So he started killing them on his own initiative. And the king's brother wanted to save the situation. He ran to the head of the line so that he would be the next to be killed. And the minister recognized him and refrained, didn't kill him. And then when the word got back to Asoka what had happened, Asoka became upset that he was indirectly responsible, and then he was motivated to make more merit. So there was probably some incidents, one way or the other, where either Jivaka monks or Buddhist monks were being killed.
Ajahn, did King Asoka's skin become smooth when he converted to Buddhism?
It's not said that, no. It doesn't say. And that detail's also only in the Asoka Wadana, the Dipawangsa. But the Asoka Wadana was a later text with a lot of colorful legendary stuff, and it's uncertain provenance, but probably Sarvastivadin. And the Dipawangsa is a Sri Lankan chronicle, Theravadin, and it begins with the life and career of Asoka, who's put Buddhism into Sri Lanka, so he was important in their history. And they make him, they don't really say anything bad about him.
See, later when he converted, he would get upset often about things. Like just thinking about his name, he wasn't so much Asoka anymore.
Yeah.
Sorrowless, you said.
Yeah.
Right?
He seems to have been a mixed character. Mm-hmm. The actual sober history, the closest we have to actual history of him is his pillar edicts. He left these. It was sort of like, I called it the Twitter of the day. And he made these pronouncements that he would put on in several languages, including Greek, and on pillars all around the kingdom with his various pronouncements, and a lot of them to do with religious stuff, telling people to refrain from needless killing of animals. And he was the first king ever, probably anywhere, who made some serious protection of animals as part of his policies.